Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into the full, holistic reality of disaster preparedness. When we think about getting ready for an emergency, our minds usually go straight to stockpiling bottled water, checking flashlight batteries, and maybe boarding up some windows. But today, we're looking way past the physical damage to uncover what it truly takes to survive the hidden aftermath.
Because here's the thing. We spend so much time prepping for the visible destruction, the power outages, the collapsed buildings, but the true survival test actually begins after the dust settles. When the immediate physical danger finally passes, a whole new set of invisible hazards creeps in. And these hazards specifically target our mental well-being and our community's stability. So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start with the hidden disaster aftermath, then look at social trauma and children and how to protect kids' mental health. From there, we'll tackle the misinformation wildfire, learn how to spot post-disaster scams, and finally, wrap up with true post-disaster resilience. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the hidden disaster aftermath, and what lies beyond the physical destruction, because disaster shatters so much more than just our infrastructure. Obviously, emergency supply kits and generators are absolutely essential for physical survival during power outages and severe storms, but they don't protect us from the cascading, unseen crises that inevitably follow. You see, a disaster doesn't just break buildings, it fundamentally tears apart the social and emotional fabric of everyday life. This collective psychological shock actually has a name. It's called social trauma, and it's basically a painful event that causes both physical and psychological harm to a group. What it does is alienate individuals from their own society, creating a deeply dissociative environment. It's that profound, terrifying feeling of a loss of control that sweeps through a whole neighborhood, literally shaking the belief systems and the very identity of everyone involved. What brings us right into Section 2, social trauma and children, the invisible wounds. We really need to talk about the most vulnerable members of our society, who simply don't have the cognitive or emotional coping mechanisms to process these massive events. To put this into perspective, let's look at some recent clinical psychotraumatology research focusing on earthquake survivors. The numbers are frankly staggering. Just under 41% of young people reported severe PTSD symptoms following the trauma of an earthquake. That is a massive portion of the next generation carrying these invisible, deeply painful wounds. And we have to understand that children don't usually vocalize their trauma the way we adults do. They aren't just going to sit down and say, "Hey, I'm feeling really anxious today." Instead, their stress manifests through intense behavioral and physical regressions. So you might see a completely independent child suddenly resorting to thumb-sucking or baby talk. You'll see psychosomatic issues like unexplained headaches or stomach aches. You might even see sudden aggression, sudden withdrawal, or really intense night terrors and bedwetting. They'll also go out of their way to avoid anything that reminds them of the trauma. But when exactly does this happen? Well, looking at the timeline of disaster psychology, the most complex emotional reactions are actually often delayed. Right away, in the immediate aftermath, there is psychological shock. This can look like freezing up or even amnesia. It's only about 2 to 6 days later that the reaction process kicks in, where anger, anxiety, and physical symptoms really peak. Then, a week or more out, a mourning process begins as the awareness of the loss truly sets in, bringing intense emotional weight. Finally, long-term, we see the recovery process of adaptation and acceptance. Understanding this timeline is absolutely crucial because a child who seems totally fine on day 1 might be struggling incredibly deeply by week 2.
Moving on to Section 3. Protecting kids' mental health and the parents' crucial role. Let's look at how parents act as the primary emotional shield for their families during all this chaos.
When we compare the risk factors against the protective factors, the takeaway is crystal clear. A parent's ability to stay calm and openly discuss the trauma is the ultimate defense against childhood PTSD. If a parent falls into maladaptive coping strategies, like completely avoiding the topic, overprotecting the child, or lashing out with anger and criticism, it severely increases the child's risk of long-term trauma. On the flip side, bringing positive emotionality, open family communication, and maintaining a secure attachment act as a profound psychological buffer. We really have to remember that kids are basically emotional sponges. They're constantly reading the room. So a parent's unaddressed panic can and will directly transfer right into the child's long-term trauma. In fact, many children will intentionally hide their own fear, simply because they don't want to be an additional burden to a parent who is clearly already stressed out. All right, Section 4, the misinformation wildfire and navigating informational hazards. Now that we understand the psychological vulnerability of a disaster zone, we have to pivot to our second hidden threat, which is the deliberate exploitation of that exact vulnerability. The really vital distinction we need to make here is the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation, that might just be a confused neighbor accidentally sharing a false rumor about road closures on Facebook. Disinformation, though, is when a bad actor intentionally tries to mislead, scare, or trick a panic's community, usually to cause chaos or set up a scam. Both of these spread like wildfire during an emergency, mostly because people are just so desperate for updates.
So, how do we fight back? Well, the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate developed a highly practical step-by-step mental checklist called the WITS method. It is a game changer that can stop the viral spread of disaster panic dead in its tracks. Before you hit retweet on that terrifying post, wait. Just take a breath. Then, investigate by checking multiple credible sources. Think critically about why you believe it. Is it just triggering your emotions? And finally, share only if you can do so responsibly and know it's verified.
There are some very tangible red flags you can look out for when your feed is flooded with chaotic updates. Watch out for fake experts. Always check their real credentials. Look really closely at those dramatic photos, because AI-generated images often have blurry edges or totally unrealistic elements. Pay attention to emotional triggers. If a post uses language specifically designed to induce immediate fear or outrage, it is trying to bypass your critical thinking. And lastly, watch out for confirmation bias. Be extra careful of things that perfectly align with your preconceived views.
Let's move into Section 5, Spotting Post-Disaster Scams, Predators in the Wreckage. This is honestly the most insidious part of the aftermath, where scammers weaponize the confusion we just talked about to steal from victims who have already lost everything.
A huge red flag to watch out for is fake charities or agents demanding payment through weird channels. Here is the absolute golden rule. A legitimate aid organization will never, ever ask you to fund relief efforts using an untraceable gift card, a wire transfer, or cryptocurrency. No way. If they ask for any of those, hang up immediately.
Another major threat might come right up to your front door. Be incredibly wary of uninvited contractors who magically appear offering quick fixes for storm damage, but demand full payment in cash up front. Always verify state licenses and get multiple estimates before you hand over a single dime to someone knocking on your door after a disaster. You also need to be on high alert for fake government scams. If someone contacts you claiming to be from FEMA, offering special aid for a processing fee, or randomly asking for your social security number out of nowhere, stop. Just hang up the phone and call the official verification number, 1-800-621-3362. That's 1-800-621-FEMA. Always go directly to the source. Finally, Section 6, True Post-Disaster Resilience, Healing the Community. Because as we look at the big picture of surviving this hidden aftermath, we have to talk about how we actually heal moving forward. There's a quote from psychoanalyst Hannah Sagal that I think perfectly captures our core takeaway today. She said, "Silence is the main crime against humanity." Ignoring the psychological trauma happening in our homes and turning a blind eye to the predatory scams in our digital feeds, well, it only deepens the wounds of the disaster. Sweeping these unseen threats under the rug simply doesn't make them go away. True resilience really is a balancing act. On one hand, recovery demands that we actively process our collective grief. We have to be incredibly open, warm, and communicative with our children's emotional needs, making sure they have a safe space to process their fear. But at the exact same time, we have to remain fiercely skeptical, highly critical, and guarded against the digital predators and the misinformation that's just waiting to exploit our panic. So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on as you build out your own holistic disaster preparedness toolkit. When the dust finally settles, how will you prepare your family to survive the unseen aftermath? By anticipating the psychological impact and arming ourselves against these informational hazards, we're not just surviving the storm. We're protecting our minds, our families, and our communities in all the days and weeks that follow. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and stay safe out there.